Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Innovation Cafe. This is the LinkedIn Live interview series hosted by Mount Sinai Innovation Partners, or MSIP, as we like to call it. MSIP is the Technology Commercialization Office at Mount Sinai. My name is Tracy Diamond, and I am the Assistant Director of Marketing and Outreach with MSIP. And I'm pleased to share that today we are joined by Dr. Xiaosi Gu. Dr. Gu is the Director of the Center for Computational Psychiatry at Mount Sinai. Welcome, Dr. Gu. It's so great to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. We're really excited to jump into this conversation with you. Dr. Gu is going to be talking about her research and innovation in mental health and how her lab is utilizing technology to really understand human behavior and ultimately help patients and society with their mental health and seeking treatment when necessary. So, Dr. Gu, we have lots to cover today. I'm really excited to jump into this conversation with you. So to kick things off, I would love to hear about your career background. So first off, what is computational psychiatry and what drew you to that field?
Yeah. So this is still a relatively new field that started about a decade ago. What is computational psychiatry? So typically, when we think about neuropsychiatric disorders, we think about very different things like, there's the brain, there's the biological processes. And I think that has been the biggest innovation in the past few decades is to recognize that there's a biological basis to mental illness, right? A field called biological psychiatry. So what computational psychiatry brings to the table is to add another element to this whole conversation, which is what we call the software of the brain, right? So if you make a parallel between like the brain, the human brain, and a computer system, or or your phone even, they're actually very similar in terms of they both have a hardware part and a software part, right? So we've been focusing a lot on the hardware part, again, genes and neurons and neural circuits and neurochemicals. But I think it's really time for us to start to talk about the software part because, more and more so, everyone starts to realize that for many psychiatric conditions, we can't find visible sort of physical damage in the brain, so to speak, right? And it seems like it's really these invisible codes or algorithms implemented by the brain that might be broken. That's the whole concept of this field. And in terms of my own background, so my interest in this whole field really started from my initial interest in human behavior, like you mentioned. I was actually a psychology major with a dual degree in economics in college. And so basically what I found in common in those two areas is that they both, study the human behavior basically, right? But from different perspectives. And of course, quickly that interest turned into an interest in the brain because the brain is the biological basis for us to, express our behavior, right? To have feelings and to make decisions, to have movements and being able to see or hear things. So that drove me to actually pursue a PhD in neuroscience right here at Mount Sinai Medical School. And so after that, so that's, I would say in the 2010s, I decided to take that further and to really sort of pursue more computational training. So following that, I did my postdoc primarily at University College London with a focus in, computational modeling. And it was actually there during that time when the field computational psychiatry sort of started to grow and explode.
That's incredible. So you were really at the forefront of this computational psychiatry movement, would you say?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think I felt very lucky to be almost at the right place at the right time. And you just kind of never know, right? When you choose your next move, I think all I can say is really follow your heart because if it feels like it's the right decision, it probably is the right decision, and kind of things will just happen in organically. And I do want to follow up by saying that I think while I was doing my computational training, I think this sort of deep sense of the importance of mental health really also grew more strongly during that time. Um, and I kind of shared this like very publicly in a few different occasions, but you know, there's basically a history of mental illness in my family, um, uh, primarily psychosis and psychotic disorder related, and actually very unfortunately, two of my sort of childhood friends, so one attempted suicide and another one in college actually completed suicide. So that was very very sort of kind of like an old trauma that was somewhat buried in memory, right? uh, but until when I had that very moment, I think I started to realize that with all the tools I have, with computational training, with neuroscience, with all I know about psychology and behavior economics, this is exactly what I want to study, right? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I'm so sorry to hear that. And thank you for sharing that with us. Transparency around mental health is absolutely critical. And if the past couple of years with the COVID-19 pandemic has really taught us anything, it's that we need to seek help and we need to talk to people about these mental health issues. I mean, of course, COVID really put to the test our health in general, whether it's physical, emotional, and of course, mental. I'd like to dig into that a little bit more regarding mental health. There is so often a stigma associated with receiving mental health or talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you feel that we can break this mentality and really change the conversation when it comes to mental health?
It's a really tough and complex issue. um, And of course, there's all sorts of cultural and historical reasons why this is the case. I think for the United States alone, we've seen a 25% increase in certain populations, especially youth, actually. So teenagers, kids ranging from 12, 13 all the way to 18. This critical period. Um, so for youth within this range who suffers at least any kind of mental health condition, jumped 25%, right? Just over 2 years. And this is why we're also seeing kind of the other learning, difficulties they're having at this moment. And of course, a lot of other behavior issues that parents are struggling with. Um, for adults, the ratio has more or less been around 20%. But of course, the type of mental health condition people are experiencing, have now kind of really mostly being expressed as things like, depression, but also social anxiety, which has become a big deal. And I think a lot of people who used to have maybe OCD, certain type of sort of rigid behaviors, were also exemplified or exaggerated during the pandemic, right? So there's a lot of issues that we have not yet even started to talk about because we're still dealing with just COVID itself, right? There is still, once in a while, there's still the discussion, the aftermath about that. But there's this, what we call a delayed mental health pandemic. And it probably is going to linger around for longer than COVID itself. And very often the impact is more invisible, right? Because again, because of the lack of awareness especially in underserved populations, uh, we don't even know that, oh, if a child is failing grades, it's actually a mental health issue and it's not necessarily a learning issue per se, right? um, so I think going back to your question, um, we have to start really right now, right here, to emphasize the importance of mental health awareness as the first step. especially in, again, underserved populations, right? Because again, the people who have been receiving treatment before pandemic are probably continuing to receive treatment. There is, of course, an increased awareness already, right, over the past 2 years, and also with the thanks to the kind of the increase or the surge of digital mental health platforms. Um, Accessibility has been lowered to some extent, right, for certain populations. But again, at a society level, this conversation has to really continue. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And you've offered up some very, very sobering statistics there about the increase in mental health challenges, OCD, and certain mental disorders. So there's clearly unmet needs in this space.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk to us a bit about your research? What's the current status of your research and what are you working on?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally speaking, my lab uses computational approaches, essentially mathematical tools, combined with uh, experimental paradigms that we learn from psychology, from behavioral economics, and from neuroscience, to examine the software part really, and how the software, the computations implemented by the brain, and how they're broken down across different psychiatric disorders. A big focus we're looking at right now is social interaction. Again, that's, I think, is a very timely topic because throughout this pandemic we all felt the importance of social interaction, right, human to human interaction, rather than just a digital type of interaction, to our mental health. And we know that social isolation was a big problem, for those, especially for those who live on their own during this whole time. Um, so my lab has been working on sort of developing paradigms as well as mathematical tools and neuroscience tools to try to essentially measure social cognition, um, across different studies. So we have a few projects going on now to look at social cognition in people with autism spectrum disorder, in those with borderline personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder, and also social anxiety. We also have collaborations going on with our neuromodulation team here at Mount Sinai to look at depression, and some other disorders. Yeah, so there's a lot going on with clinical studies, um, but my dream is really to try to be able to do this like at a very much larger scale, right? Because eventually lower accessibility, we need to have very diverse samples that are truly representative of the population. So this most exciting thing that we did recently was we developed a digital app, um, that essentially includes a few games that we developed, um, that measure different aspects of social interaction. So you can try to download it. It's called the Social Brain app. Um, and you can find it either in your iOS or Android stores. But with those sort of gamified versions of our experimental paradigm, we're really trying to be able to measure social cognition in the context of mental health surveys and questions, uh, across the entire nation, right? So anyone with a smartphone should be able to download it for free and use it and contribute some data to a scientific project.
That's incredible. So that's the Social Brain app. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Excellent. I will definitely be checking that out. Now, you touched upon this as well, almost the disparities in mental health care and seeking treatment. How do you feel that this app will help sort of bridge the gap and offer a more equitable coping mechanism or technology, really,
Mhm.
that is widely accessible?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So for most of the other studies that are run in the laboratory, right, using different MRI or invasive recording paradigms, those are a very particular type of patients that we can measure, right? Even if we just run studies in healthy controls, typically these are recruited from, like, let's say the student population, or uh, a small sample that might not be truly representative of our society. But with the app, the goal is to really be able to measure everybody's mental health and their behavior, because we already know, right? There's a lot of insight from other fields like genomics, for example, that scientific findings, again, very rigorous studies, findings from these high impact journals or papers might not really be applicable to a diverse population, right? If your original findings are only based on, let's say, Caucasians or college students who go to a elite university, or medical students, right? And because most of us are not like that. And so I think genomics was a great example, because they've already realized this issue and are now trying to build very diverse genomic pools. And I think for our research, for psychiatry and sort of behavioral research, as well as neuroscience research using humans, we really need to realize this as a critical issue, right? We can't just take the brains from, again, highly educated Mount Sinai students or NYU students and apply that finding or the conclusion to be generalizable, right, to the whole population. That's just not true.
Right. That's great to hear how diversity is applied to scientific research to ultimately help diverse populations. It's very interesting to hear that key connection there, and that you and your lab has really been doing all of that due diligence to make sure that you're hitting all of those points to reach the right individuals and demographics. Now, you have been working closely with MSIP to help bring this technology to life, and you also participated in MSIP's Entrepreneurship program, specifically the Technology Launchpad, and of course our annual Mount Sinai Pitch Challenge. Can you talk a bit about your experience in the program and what you learned from it?
Absolutely. I personally felt that I learned a lot from, the program, because, entrepreneurial training is non-existent, right, in any neuroscience PhD program, as far as I know, or any part of like a scientific, like a typical scientific training path, right? Definitely not in your undergrads, or even when you do a postdoc, unless you do that in an industrial setting. So I clearly benefited a lot from that. I actually think every scientist should really try something like that, because one, if something actually come out of it, it's great, right? If you can develop a product, a whatever, a software or a service that can be really beneficial to the public, that's a great outcome. But two, even if not, I think just having that very different perspective to then re-examine your own work, you really see something different, right? This is how I truly felt. Probably the biggest take home I had was that I can really see which part of my work can be the most impactful, from like a real world perspective, right? Because sometimes scientists are so sort of sucked in this, deep hole that of the scientific, publishing and grant writing realm, and sometimes lose sight of the true impact of their work in real life. And I think people can really benefit from this program in this regard.
That's great to hear that it was so beneficial, and really making, the nexus between science and business. Those are ultimately two different worlds that need to be connected in order to bring solutions to patients. So I'm glad to hear that you had a good experience and that you would recommend it for scientists. Now, Dr. Gu, I have one more question for you before we wrap up. It's a two-part question. On a more personal note, I'd love to hear more about your experiences as a female minority innovator. And what advice would you give to other female minority innovators to really achieve success in science and medicine?
That's a big task. I would say, one, be true to yourself, right? So trust yourself. This is, again, it kind of sounds crazy, but including myself, but I also know that to be true for a lot of female leaders who seem to have made it, right? So to speak, still constantly have this fear or almost like imposter syndrome in some way, to not always trusting our own judgment to the full extent. I would say we really need to just be true ourselves and really trust our own decisions, right? That's clearly a hurdle I jumped over myself, sort of transition, especially when you first transition from a trainee position to a group leader position, right, as a principal investigator. Uh, and the second thing I want to say is, be fearless. That for me was also even harder than the first part, because I mean, we all have our own, again, insecurities and fears, right? And um, and I think that at some point in my life, I basically decided I'm just gonna drop that. It sounds easier than it was, but it was, of course, after, some ups and downs earlier in my career, I've decided that fear itself is not very helpful. It is helpful in, like, life and death situations, right? But it's not very helpful in a professional environment, because once you stay true to your heart and you believe what you said or what you want to do is going to be true or be going to be, impactful, um, you just have to ignore everything else, people's criticism or, conflicts or other things, to be noise. If when you think of those as noise and kind of very stay laser focused, and you can sort of somehow got to this like fearless, state of your career, and then you can really, excel from there, right? um but it definitely, again, I'm not saying, just sitting here saying that as if it's really easy. For me, that involved a lot of, personal and professional ups and downs, clearly. So it takes some trial and error. And, but put yourself out there, because you'll see that even when you fail, it's not that scary.
That is sound advice. And I like that as a mantra or a new motto. Even when you fail, it's not that scary. And to be fearless, I feel like that is applicable to many aspects of life, and of course, including your professional career.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for that piece of advice. And of course, Dr. Gu, thank you so much for your time today. It was so great to hear about your research and what's happening at the Center for Computational Psychiatry. I personally look forward to seeing all of the great things that come from you and your lab. And of course, we can all go check out the Social Brain app, which is available on smartphones now. And thank you all for tuning in today. Please keep an eye out for the recording of this interview, which we will be posting on MSIP's YouTube channel and promoting via LinkedIn and social media. So you can always rewatch this interview, or you can share the link with your friends and colleagues who may be interested in this conversation. So thank you all again for tuning in, and thank you, Dr. Gu. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.